This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Kicking off today's show is livestock economist Elliott Dennis from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln with a cattle market update. He discusses futures, the recent Product of the USA label ruling, and a meat processors program. K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth continues the show by sharing answers to many questions he has been getting about alfalfa weevils and pea aphids. Drew Ricketts, K-State wildlife specialist, finishes today's show by talking about moles. He says why now is the time for people to be figuring out how to manage them, and he also explains the different and best options to do so. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with the cattle market update. And this week we're joined by University of Nebraska-Lincoln livestock economist Elliott Dennis. Elliott, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Elliott, wanting to start off our conversation looking at live cattle futures and some deterioration we saw this week.
Yeah, really, when we look at really across the board, the markets were really middling during this week. But then during Wednesday, we saw a pretty big jump up, and it looked like we were going to break some resistance. And then just follow that up with Thursday, and Thursday was the exact opposite. We really had pretty much a complete reversal. And really what that market was showing was there was a lot of resistance at that 185 range. And really that resistance level was set all the way back in September of last year. This is for the June futures contract that's going to end here. So really kind of continue to show some resistance. Really the question that's been on my mind is what is going to be the demand driver that's going to really pull that value up forward. There's been a little bit of discontinuity between what the futures have been doing and what we're seeing on the cash market. Basis is widening quite a bit, and we really could be looking at some record cash prices in the future if we continue to see trends in the market kind of continue, but kind of where that ends up with basis kind of remains to be seen.
And as you're talking about cash, what could we see in these next couple months?
Yeah, interesting enough, when we think about kind of where we're at on a seasonal index and where we're at really in 2023 was kind of a bit unique because we started off really on a slow growth, and normally we would have peaked sometime on the cash price in the April, May, but it really just kind of continued a steady upward trend until about June. And it's really plateaued on June, so it was really kind of counter-cyclical to what we currently observe in a typical cash market. Really, right now we're sitting at 185. Really, that the record's highs that we could go as high as 195 if we continue on like a seasonal average. Now, I think there's a lot of reasons why we won't hit those levels, but if we continue to kind of trend upwards, I think we could potentially be in that 190s. But then it comes back to what's going to happen when we come to contract. We know that, at time of delivery, when that live cattle contract is going to expire, we should have convergence. And so the question is always who's going to converge with what. Some of the work that I've shown is kind of that direction of convergence, and most of the time it's futures coming up to meet cash. And so I'm going to be really looking sometime the beginning of April, and definitely in April and beginning part of June. I'll be really looking at kind of where we're at in the cash market, where that basis is, and really we'll start to see some convergence then.
And Elliott, as we're thinking about things in the cattle market, where is cutout heading?
Yeah, so this is kind of when we talk about where that cash market has the potential to go. Really, seasonally, we'd expect that cutout to continue to gain in value. We're about $3.05 on the USDA composite cutout. Through May and June, seasonally, we should be hitting about 320. So at least that shows some support that, if consumer demand continues to stay strong, that we should have some pull. Now, there's some reasons in the retail demand why we might expect some headwinds there, and why we might have that full pull through going the next several months.
And Elliott, you mentioned that you don't see us hitting the levels of 195. And what are a few of those reasons that you don't see us going up there?
I think the primary reason is just where we're at on price levels and kind of consumer demand. When we look at where we are at in demand the last several years, we had really record demands, and that was really supporting a lot of cash prices. As we're starting to think about herd expansion, at least the inventory numbers tends to be in our favor, but at price levels, people are starting to consume a little bit less. We've seen that on the consumer demand index really starting to come down. We are down 4 points over last year. Obviously, we're coming off a really, really strong high, so it's a little bit relative there, but definitely the headwinds as we start to see kind of consumer valuations of where that demand could head. And really what that ends up doing is weaker demand ends up passing down and really kind of holding back where prices could actually go.
And Elliott, also wanting to mention some recent ruling that's come out with Product of the USA labeling.
Yeah, so this has been a long time in the making. I think people who have been an advocate of Product of the USA labeling have really championed this effort. And a lot of work was really done in the early 2000s on whether or not there was value in this labeling. A lot of this comes from, we import a lot of Mexican cattle, and we import a lot, so those tend to be in the feeder cattle side, and we import a lot of fed cattle on the Canadian side. And really the question was, well, these animals are coming in, they're being fed here, they're being harvested here, and then they're being labeled as Product of the USA. There are some in the industry that believe that because of that label, people are willing to pay a premium. So, there's been a lot of work, particularly at Kansas State, that shows that there's probably mixed results on that, of whether people pay a premium because they actually see Product of the USA. But regardless of where that's at, the new ruling came out, and that if there is a label put on the Product of the USA, what that means is that it has to be born, raised, and processed here in the United States. So, once again, if we're importing Mexican cattle in and we're feeding them here, they're being harvested, they can't have that label on it. If we're importing fat cattle from Canada and they're processed here, they can't have that label. Now, this isn't a mandatory label, right? Product of the USA has never been mandatory, and the current ruling doesn't change that. All it does is just saying, if you are going to put that label on there, Product of the USA, it has to meet these certain specifications. Regardless of, I think, where you're at on that spectrum, whether you think it adds value or not, I think it still kind of clarifies the issue of what this means to the consumer. And there is something to be said about that when we look at the different value-added programs out there, or even something as simple as organics. The consumers want to have clarity on what they're actually buying, what it means, what it doesn't mean. And so I think, at least from that standpoint, it does go a long way to say, okay, Product of the USA is born, raised, harvested here. And for that, I applaud the USDA.
And when does this ruling go into effect?
Yeah, so Vilsack announced it this week. I don't know exactly the exact date that it goes into effect, but it certainly is a step forward for the industry as we move forward.
And as we're talking about the cattle market, wanting to mention something you're working on at the University of Nebraska, a meat processors training program, and what could that mean for the industry?
Part of that press conference with the Product of the USA was also the Secretary of Agriculture kind of touting everything that the Biden-Harris administration has done to really help processors and help to kind of meat processing competition. And one of the things that they're highlighting is the really access to funds and improving meat processing capacity. As we all know, during COVID, there were issues with meat processing. A lot of work has been done on that. But part of the administration's response to that was really twofold. One was to think about legislation, and that's when we started thinking about fair marketing, anti-cooperative stuff that was being investigated. And on this other side, they were saying, maybe we need to start, providing some grant dollars for meat processing plants to really develop. And that focus for them was really on small and very small meat processing plants. They spent a lot of money to give money to basically build expansion. And so that's where you saw some of those larger plants receiving dollars to build out capacity. And part of that was also developing training programs. So once we have capacity, how do we ensure that these small processing plants that are servicing local communities stay in business? Well, myself and a couple other meat scientists here at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, we applied for and received a grant to help small and very small meat processors in local communities. This would be like our local locker either custom exempt or federally inspected, to really step out of the role of I'm really great at cutting meat and people in my community like me, to how do I become a good business manager? How do I make good decisions? How do I price meat correctly? How do I run a plant effectively? And so this weekend in March, we're welcoming in our first cohort from plants from 5 different states throughout the U.S. We'll be working through a 12-month management training program, and they'll learn things like financial statements, pricing, value-added marketing, ways to measure and calculate yield. And at the end, the highlight is really an on-plant inspection where they actually get a trained professional that will come in and see how well they've been implementing those practices that they've been developing throughout the 12-month program. So we think it will do a lot to meet USDA's goals of trying to, A, develop infrastructure, and B, to ensure that people that serve these local communities that often are maybe smaller can stay in business and continue to provide some rural vitality going into the future.
Elliott, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us our cattle market update.
Yep. Thanks for having me again, Shelby.
That was University of Nebraska-Lincoln livestock economist Elliott Dennis. Before we cut to a break, I'd like to remind you that as we cut to this break, if you're also reaching your destination and aren't going to be able to hear the rest of the show, you can always find this show and previous shows by going to agtoday.net, or you can find it on the podcast streaming platform of your choice. We're cutting to that short break now, but when we come back, we'll be joined by K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Monday show discussing alfalfa weevils and pea aphids. And then to talk about it, we're joined by K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. Jeff, thanks for joining us today.
Oh, sure. My pleasure. Anytime.
Jeff, you've been receiving a lot of questions about alfalfa weevils and wanting to answer a few of them today.
Alfalfa weevils every year come earlier and earlier, it seems to me, and this year's no exception. Generally, I count on about the first to mid part of April for the alfalfa weevils to start hatching around the state, but it's all predicated upon temperatures. And while I'm on that, you can go to the K-State Mesonet, and it will tell you starting from January 1st, accumulating thermal units, growing degree days, whatever you want to call them, in your area based upon where the closest weather station is relative to the eggs hatching on the alfalfa weevils starting from January 1st. This year, that has been very accurate. It actually predicted most or a lot of the eggs would hatch about 2 to 3 weeks ago, and that was right on. That's when I first, and that doesn't tell you how big your infestation is going to be. That just tells you when to get out and start looking, because the eggs will hatch and the larvae will start feeding. Just cuts out a little bit of your time. But anyway, I used that. I was out probably a month ago around north central Kansas, down in south central Kansas. There were a few larvae hatching out at that time, not enough to worry about. And then we had a cold spell, and this winter so far has been really kind of unusually warm, but then we've had some cold spells, some really pretty cold spells. And when I talk about enough cold weather to kill alfalfa weevils, it takes 2 to 3 hours of mid-20 degrees, 20 degree Fahrenheit weather to actually kill them. So if it just goes down to 25, 26, and then shoots right back up, that's not going to do the job. The second thing about that is it's not going to kill adults or eggs. It's just going to basically kill the little newly hatched first instar larvae. And that happened a month ago now because they were starting to hatch out. Then we had that cold spell, and actually I went out and found a bunch of brown or black dead first instar larvae. So keep that in mind. That's another caution I want. Everybody's calling me and wanting to know if they should start spraying because they're finding weevils and they're finding damage from weevils. And that's two different things. Number one, if you find a little bit of damage, it might be that the weevils started feeding and then we had a cold spell and it killed them. So make sure you actually find the weevil, not just the little pinholes in the plants. Because that, like I said, that might be from a larvae that was killed from some other reason, mainly cold weather. Also, I was out looking last week when it was in the mid-70s Wednesday, Thursday. I started finding larvae again, but the prediction is for the weather to get down to the mid-20s, so you have to look in your area around the state from last night, from Sunday night, right? Because some places it got down to the mid-20s, some places in the high 20s, so you just have to go out and see if it was low enough for long enough to help you with the larvae and killing those first instar larvae. So, every year in Kansas, that's one of the problems we have with alfalfa weevil control. They usually seem to come out from the eggs earlier than we want them to, and every year we got, wind, rain, sleet, hail, snow, and cold weather, so you never know if you need to treat or not. That means you need to get out and actually sample. Two ways to sample. Number one, if you just want to get out to look to see if there are any live larvae in your field, use a sweep net. It's easier, it takes a lot less time. You can just sweep sample several different places in your field, and if you got larvae, then it's time to get the old white 1-gallon bucket out, at least that's what we use, and start taking a stem and shake it vigorously in the bucket and count how many larvae are per stem. So you do that, 10 stems here, 10 stems there, count the number of stems you did, number of larvae. That gives you your infestation level. We use 30 to 50% infestation to treat. I would use that no matter where we are, unless you look at the weather and they're predicting mid-20s in the next 4 or 5 days. Otherwise, you probably should start treating at that time. Right now, we've had some dry weather, at least around the central part of the state, so we can get into the fields. I've gotten some reports from some friends down in Oklahoma. They're spraying in the middle part, right around Stillwater, Ponca City. They're spraying alfalfa weevils. That means usually they're about a week ahead of us down there just because of the warmer weather, the warmer temperatures. So, and that kind of moves up the state from south to north. So I would look around the Sumner County, the county line, Wichita area, and that part of the state probably, if this cold spell doesn't take out any larvae, probably towards the end of this week or maybe, the first part of the next week, you need to get out and check and see if you have the 25 to 50% infestation level and start treating at that point in time while you can based upon the weather. The other question I always get is, what product to use. You can go to our website. On our website, we have our latest insecticide efficacy trials that we've run, and you can see that most of the insecticides work pretty well. I say that with the idea in mind that we probably use more carrier or water per acre than most commercial applicators do. When we put out our trials, we use 15 gallons per acre. A lot of commercial applicators will use less than that just from a practical standpoint. They're trying to get as many acres covered as possible, and I understand that. But just remember, these are contact insecticides, so they have to contact the larvae. And if you have a pretty good stand of alfalfa, there's quite a bit of foliage out there, and the larvae are going to be tucked in to the terminals where they're pretty well protected. So you got to make sure you use enough carrier or water to get that insecticide to where those little larvae are. The other thing, as the larvae get older, once they become second, third instars, somehow they perceive cold weather coming. And I've seen it many different times where you get a cold spell and you go out and check and all the first instar larvae are dead, but if you look in the leaf litter and the bottom of the canopy, the second, third instar larvae will be just fine because they crawl down the plant and they hide under that leaf litter where they're protected between the soil and, the air temperature. And as soon as it warms back up, they'll crawl back up the plant and start feeding. If the field's been treated, chances are that foliage at the bottom hasn't been, just because it's been protected because of the canopy, and they'll start feeding on the untreated foliage. So you'll think the insecticide didn't get to them, but it's just where they were. They were protected down in the base of down in the soil at the base of the canopy. So keep that in mind when you're out looking. If you find a bunch of dead ones, but you find a bunch of pinhole prick-sized holes in your leaves and the terminals, just scratch around if it's still cold in the morning. Now, if it warms back up, they'll start crawling back up the plant. But scratch around in the in the leaf litter, and you'll see these little green larvae, and they'll be in a C-shaped where they're down there, and they were protected from the cold. And the cold weather is not going to kill the adults or the egg stage, because those are the stages that overwinter anyway. So it's really just that first instar. It's just really a matter of timing. In 2017, 2018, we had cold spells like we have this year so far. It really decimated the populations. Those are the only 2 years, probably in the last 25 years, that I have seen fields that didn't require an insecticide application to protect them from alfalfa weevils. So keep that in mind. Just after a cold spell, get out with a sweep net if you have one. Sample real quick if you have some larvae. Get out with your bucket and try and determine the level of your infestation before you treat.
And wanting to also mention then pea aphids and how they could also be out right now.
Yes, the other insect that you might be running into in your alfalfa field are pea aphids. They're the cool weather aphid. When you spray your alfalfa weevils, you'll kill all the aphids. The problem is the aphids are going to come back pretty quickly because they reproduce parthenogenically. That means they don't have to look for a mate. They don't have to wait to lay eggs. They don't have to wait for the eggs to hatch. They just start producing females. Those females start feeding on the plants also. I generally don't recommend treating pea aphids if you have a pretty good stand. But if it's a new stand and the plants are struggling anyway for moisture, which they are in different places around the state, then you might want to consider a pea aphid treatment. Again, the efficacy trials we've conducted on pea aphids are on our website. The thing is, if you spray for alfalfa weevils and pea aphids, any of these, you're going to kill all the other beneficials. A lot of beneficials use alfalfa early on, green lacewings and lady beetles. They use the alfalfa canopy early on. They've overwintered there, and they're still out there. So when you spray it, you can't help it if you're going to spray weevils. If you don't spray that first cutting of alfalfa weevils, you're going to donate a majority of it to the alfalfa weevil. Not so pea aphids. If the weather kills all of the alfalfa weevils, you'll be really lucky. But if it does and you decide you want to spray pea aphids, I would maybe reconsider. Make sure you got 20 to 50 pea aphids per stem, and there are no lady beetles or green lacewings out there, because those will build up and then they will be there to spread out in sorghum, soybeans, other crops later in the year. May help with some of the other aphids. So just keep that in mind. The two pests in alfalfa right now, alfalfa weevil, that's a serious, severe pest, and pea aphids are out there also.
That was K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. I will link the Mesonet and the insecticide efficacy trials in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Monday show discussing moles. And then to talk about it, we're joined by K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. Drew, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
Drew, why are we wanting to talk about moles right now?
Well, the late winter, early spring is when we start to see lots of mole activity in yards or parks or golf courses and turf grass, basically. And that's because during the wintertime, they go down further deep in the soil profile, and then as the soil warms up, the insects and earthworms that are their prey start to become more active in the shallower parts of the soil profile or the parts closer to the surface. And so the moles are out there feeding. And, some folks like me don't really worry about moles in our yard. It's just part of life. And as a wildlife biologist, I enjoy seeing critters out there. But there are a lot of folks who see that as property damage. They spend a lot of time taking care of their turf, and they want it to be nice. And this is a good time to, as we start to see that mole activity show up, go ahead and start controlling those moles, because they shouldn't have reproduced yet. By the time this airs, we might be getting into when they're starting to reproduce, but this is a good time to go ahead and get them under control if you're worried about them before you start to have a whole lot more moles from the reproduction.
And how can people identify these in their lawn?
In the lawn, so typically what we're going to see is two different types of damage, and one of those is the runs that we'll see, and it's basically where the moles are moving around just below the grass, and they're pushing up ridges out in the yard, and as you're walking along, you might feel a spongy sort of trail under your foot, and so that's one of the ways that a lot of folks find them. And then when they're down deeper in the soil profile, maybe it's dry or maybe it's those colder months, they have to empty out the tunnels that they are digging down low, and so they'll push up these molehills of soil out in the yard.
And so as we're thinking about this, there are a few different ways to be able to control a mole.
There are, and the two probably proven methods that we would look at would be either toxicants or traps. The challenge with toxicants is it's really hard to get a predatory species to eat something that's not animate. And so toxicants show variable effectiveness. And the saying that's been out there for a long time is you can fool some of the moles all the time and all the moles some of the time, but you'll never fool all the moles all the time. So we need to either learn how to trap moles or learn how to live with them.
And can you tell us a little bit more about trapping moles?
Yeah, so there's several different styles of mole traps, and they're all very effective if we use them appropriately. There are a couple of styles that go actually down inside of the run that would be kind of an inline trap that would pinch them as they come through. There's the old harpoon-style trap that looks like it's got some spikes on the side that punch down through the top of the mole run and then grab them or impale them, basically. And then there's a couple of different styles of scissor traps that would sit with the jaws sort of straddling the run from above, and then as the mole comes through and pushes up on the trigger, then they get pinched real quick. And it's a body gripping trap that kills them really quickly.
Is there a way they can learn more about these different traps?
Absolutely. So we just published a sort of all-encompassing mole trapping video on YouTube. It's on the KSRE Wildlife Management YouTube channel, and it's really easy to find. Just punch in at KSRE Wildlife, and it'll come up. But in that video, we go over how to identify mole sign, how to identify the best places to set traps for moles, and then we also show how to effectively set 4 different types of mole traps that are really common for folks to use.
And what do people need to do with the mole after they trap it?
You know, if we live in the country where we don't have to worry about, normal sanitation practices and that sort of stuff, just putting the mole outside of the yard where other critters might have an opportunity to use that as food is an acceptable thing to do. But typically when we do have dead wildlife that we've controlled, double bagging them and putting them in the household trash to be taken to a landfill is the most common practice that would be widely accepted.
Drew, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and share with us some information about moles.
Sure. Thanks for having me again.
That was K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. I will link the video in today's show notes on agtoday.net. That's all we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Tuesday.